Jeff Bezos paid $0 in federal income tax in 2007. Elon Musk paid $0 in 2018. Carl Icahn, the billionaire activist investor, paid $0 in 2015, 2016, and 2017. And here's the thing that makes it even more absurd. They weren't breaking any laws. They weren't hiding money in Cayman Island shell companies. They were using a perfectly legal strategy that's been around for decades. One that your accountant probably won't tell you about because you need at least $1 million in assets before it starts making mathematical sense. The ultra-wealthy have essentially figured out how to access infinite money without triggering a single taxable event. So the question isn't whether this loophole exists. The question is, at what net worth does it become your ethical responsibility to yourself to stop playing by working class tax rules? I'm going to walk you through exactly how the buy, borrow, die strategy works, why it's getting more powerful as interest rates shift, and the specific dollar threshold where this stops being theoretical and starts being the actual optimal financial move. Because here's what nobody wants to admit. The tax code isn't designed to catch rich people. It's designed to tax income. And the wealthy stopped having income decades ago. By the way, I built a free early retirement calculator because most online ones are mathematically wrong. It uses BlackRock and Vanguard logic to expose the weak points in your plan. And I only ask for your email to send the report, so I don't store any of your financial data. Link in the description. Look, most people think about wealth in two categories. You've got your checking account where your paycheck lands and you pay bills. Then you've got your savings and investment accounts where you're building net worth. This is the mental model we're all taught. Earn money, pay taxes on it, spend what's left, maybe save some. The IRS loves this model because they get their cut at step one, before you even see the full amount. But the wealthy operate with a secret third account, and this is where everything changes. This third account isn't really an account at all. It's a line of credit secured by their assets. They figured out that there are actually three types of money in the financial system. There's earned money, which gets destroyed by income tax. There's gained money from selling assets, which gets hit by capital gains tax. And then there's borrowed money, which has zero tax liability because debt isn't income. The government can't tax you on a loan. Think about that. When you take out a mortgage, you don't pay income tax on the $400,000 the bank just deposited into your account. That money spends exactly the same as earned income, but the IRS treats it completely differently. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like a fancy way to go into debt. And yeah, on the surface, borrowing money to fund your lifestyle sounds financially insane. Your parents probably warned you about living on credit cards. Dave Ramsey would have an aneurysm. But here's what makes this different. The wealthy aren't borrowing against future earnings. They're borrowing against assets that are actively appreciating faster than the interest rate on the loan. Let me show you how this works with real numbers. Say you're worth $5 million, all in an S&P 500 index fund. Historically, that's going to grow about 10% per year on average. That's $500,000 in annual growth. Now, if you wanted to access that money the normal way, you'd sell some shares. Let's say you need $200,000 to live on. You sell, you pay 15% long-term capital gains tax. So $30,000 goes to the government. You net $170, fine. You're still rich, stop complaining. But here's the alternative. You go to a wealth management firm. These are called securities-backed lines of credit. Or you might hear them called portfolio loans or margin loans, though margin is technically different. You put up your $5 million in stocks as collateral. The bank says, we'll lend you up to 50 to 70% of that portfolio value. You borrow $200,000 at, let's say, 4% interest. That's $8,000 in annual interest. No taxes, no capital gains event. Your stocks are still there, still compounding. That $5 million is still growing at 10%, adding $500,000 in value. You're paying $8,000 in interest to access $200,000 in liquidity. Your net worth went up $492,000 that year, while you spent $200,000, and you paid zero in income tax. Now you're asking yourself, okay, but don't I have to pay back the loan? And this is where it gets really interesting, because the answer is not really. The next year, your portfolio is now worth $5.5 million. You borrow another $200,000 against the new higher value. You use part of that to pay the interest on the first loan. You're just rolling the debt forward. The bank doesn't care because the collateral keeps growing. You're not a risk. You're profitable for them. They're collecting interest on an ever-growing loan balance, secured by assets they can liquidate instantly if anything goes wrong. This is the financial equivalent of a perpetual motion machine. Except it actually works because asset prices have been inflating for a century. But now you might think, eventually you die. Then what? The loan comes due, right? Your estate has to sell everything and pay it back? Wrong. This is where the strategy goes from clever to genuinely absurd. When you die, there's this tax provision called step up in basis. Your heirs inherit your assets at their current market value, not what you originally paid. So, if you bought Amazon stock at $50 and it's worth $3,000 when you die, your kid's cost basis is $3,000. All that gain, decades of appreciation, is erased for tax purposes. If they sell it the next day, zero capital gains tax. None. The IRS just forgives millions in theoretical tax liability because you had the courtesy to die. So your estate takes that stepped up stock, sells just enough to pay off the loan, and the rest passes to your heirs tax-free. You spent decades living on borrowed money, paid maybe 2 to 4% interest instead of 15 to 37% in taxes. And when the bill finally came due, your heirs paid it with tax-free dollars. Buy assets, borrow against them, die before selling. Buy, borrow, die. That's the whole strategy. 3 words that let you opt out of the income tax system entirely. Now, here's where the incentive structure gets weird. The people who designed this system, Congress, the tax code writers, they knew this would happen. This isn't an accidental loophole. Step up in basis has been in the tax code since 1921. It's survived a century of tax reform because the people writing tax law are the same people benefiting from it. Senators have stock portfolios. They understand exactly how this works. But changing it would mean admitting that the bottom 90% of earners are playing a completely different game with completely different rules. So instead, we get political theater about raising tax rates on high earners, which sounds good but doesn't touch this strategy at all. You can raise the top income tax rate to 70%. It's irrelevant if wealthy people aren't recognizing income. I've been running businesses for over a decade. I've sat in rooms with accountants and tax attorneys who've explained this stuff in painful detail. And the psychological shift that happens when you understand this is profound. You stop thinking about how much can I earn and start thinking about how much can I borrow. The entire frame changes. Normal people are taught to fear debt. Wealthy people are taught that debt is a tool, and the cheapest tool available if you have collateral. There was this study from ProPublica in 2021 where they got IRS data on the wealthiest Americans. They calculated what they called a true tax rate, not just income tax as a percent of income, but total taxes paid as a percent of wealth growth. For normal people, this number is close to their income tax bracket. If you're in the 22% bracket, you're probably paying close to that on your actual economic gains. But for the ultra wealthy, the number was insane. Jeff Bezos, whose net worth grew by $99 billion between 2014 and 2018, had a true tax rate of 0.98%, less than 1%. Warren Buffett was 0.1%. These aren't my numbers. This is the IRS's own data. And look, to be fair, I'm not here to moralize about whether this is right or wrong. That's not my job. I'm here to explain how the machine works. But you have to understand the psychology of why this persists. The bottom 50% of earners pay almost nothing in federal income tax anyway, so they're not the revenue base. The middle class pays the bulk of income tax revenue, but they don't have enough assets to use buy, borrow, die. They're trapped in the W-2 system. And the top 1% has enough political power to ensure that wealth taxes or changes to step up in basis never make it through Congress. So the system is stable. Everyone has an incentive to keep it exactly as it is. Now, the obvious question is, what's the minimum viable threshold to make this work? Because I know what you're thinking. This is great for Elon, but I've got 100 grand in my 401k. What am I supposed to do? And that's the right question. The math doesn't pencil out until you hit a certain scale. Most banks won't even offer securities-backed lines of credit unless you have at least $500,000 in investable assets. Some require $1 million. The interest rates get better as you borrow more. If you're borrowing $50,000, you might pay 6 or 7%. If you're borrowing $5 million, you might pay 3%. The system literally rewards scale. But here's where it gets practical. If you have between $500,000 and $1 million in a taxable brokerage account, not a 401k, not an IRA, those have different rules, you're at the threshold where this starts to make sense. Let's say you're 50 years old. You've got $800,000 in a brokerage account, all in index funds. You want to retire early, but you're not 59 and a half yet, so pulling from retirement accounts means penalties. You could sell some of your brokerage account, pay capital gains tax, and live on that. Or you could borrow $200,000 at 4%, $8,000 a year in interest, and let the $800,000 keep compounding. Over a 10-year period, until you can access your 401k without penalty, that decision could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in after-tax wealth. Here's a concrete example. Two people, both 50 years old, both with $800,000 in stocks. Person A sells $50,000 a year to live on. After 15% capital gains tax, they net $42,500. Over 10 years, they've pulled out $500,000 in value from their account, paid $75,000 in taxes, and their remaining balance has grown, but they've been constantly selling, so the compounding is weaker. Person B borrows $50,000 a year against their portfolio at 4% interest. They're paying $2,000 a year in interest, but their full $800,000 stays invested. By year 10, person A might have $700,000 left. Person B still has the original $800,000, which has now grown to over $2 million at 10% annually, minus the $500,000 in loans and about $100,000 in cumulative interest paid. They're ahead by about $600,000. The math isn't even close. Now, there's a risk here that banks don't advertise. It's called a margin call. If your portfolio value drops too much, the bank will force you to either add more collateral or sell assets to pay down the loan. This is what happened to a lot of wealthy people in 2008. Portfolio drops 40%, suddenly you're over-leveraged, the bank makes you liquidate at the worst possible time, you get crushed. So the strategy has a hidden leverage risk that only shows up during crashes. The people who survived 2008 with this strategy were the ones who kept their loan-to-value ratio conservative, borrowing 30 or 40% of portfolio value instead of maxing out at 70%. That buffer is what keeps you from getting liquidated in a panic. There's also this weird psychological trap that happens. Once you start living on borrowed money, it doesn't feel real. There's no pain of paying, your portfolio keeps growing, your lifestyle stays the same. You start to feel invincible. And that's when people get stupid. They borrow more, they buy a second house, they leverage up. And then the market turns, and suddenly they're in a hole they can't climb out of. I've seen this personally. Guy I know borrowed against his portfolio to buy a vacation property, then borrowed more to renovate it, then the market dropped, and he had to sell both properties at a loss just to clear the margin call, destroyed a decade of wealth building because he got greedy. So the psychological discipline required is actually higher than just living on a salary. With a salary, you can't spend more than you earn. Reality imposes a limit. With asset-backed borrowing, the only limit is your own risk tolerance and self-control. The bank will let you hang yourself if you want to. There's also this darker element that nobody talks about. This strategy works because asset prices keep inflating. But asset prices keep inflating partly because the wealthy keep buying assets instead of consuming. They're not selling to fund lifestyles. They're holding and borrowing. That creates persistent buy pressure on stocks and real estate, which pushes prices higher, which makes everyone who doesn't own assets poorer in relative terms. It's a feedback loop that increases wealth inequality by design. The system rewards people who already have assets and punishes people who don't. You can argue that's just capitalism, but it's worth understanding the mechanism. Imagine you're at a casino. Most people are playing slots, which have a house edge. A few people have figured out there's a secret room in the back where the house edge is negative. The game is rigged in your favor, but you need a $100,000 buy-in to enter the room. So most people never even know it exists. They keep playing slots, wondering why they never win. That's the tax system. The game in the main room is designed to extract from you. The game in the back room is designed to reward you, but access is gated by wealth. Now, Congress occasionally pretends to care about this. There have been proposals to eliminate step-up in basis. Biden proposed it in 2021. It went nowhere. Because the moment you threaten step-up in basis, every family farm and small business owner in America freaks out. You're gonna tax me on the appreciation of land my grandfather bought? And they're not wrong to worry. The problem is that any rule that closes the loophole for billionaires also hits upper middle class families who inherit a house or a small business. So the politics are impossible. The only way to fix this is a wealth tax, which is even more politically toxic and possibly unconstitutional. So the strategy isn't going anywhere. If anything, it's getting more powerful. Interest rates were near zero for a decade after 2008. You could borrow against your portfolio at 2%. The S&P was returning 10 to 15%. The spread was absurd, free money. Even now, with rates higher, the math still works if you're conservative. As long as asset appreciation exceeds borrowing costs, the machine runs. Here's what you actually need to know if you want to use this. 3 things. 1, you need at least $500,000 to $1 million in a taxable brokerage account before this makes sense. Below that, the interest rates are too high and the tax savings too small. It's not worth the complexity. 2. Keep your loan-to-value ratio under 40%, 50% maximum if you're aggressive. Anything higher and you're exposed to margin calls in a correction. The people who blow up are the ones who max out their borrowing. 3. This works best when you're older and closer to death. That sounds morbid, but it's true. If you're 40 and you start borrowing against your portfolio, you've got 30 or 40 years before step up in basis kicks in. That's a lot of compounding interest. But if you're 65 and your investment horizon is 15 years, the math is much cleaner. You borrow, you live, you die, your heirs win. The strategy is literally optimized for people who are checking out soon. And if you think that's cynical, you're right. The strategy is called buy, borrow, die for a reason. Your death is the exit event. It's the moment when all the deferred taxes get forgiven and the loan gets repaid with tax-free dollars. The system is designed to reward people for accumulating assets and then dying with them. That's the actual incentive structure. Look, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do this. I'm saying you should understand that this is how wealth actually moves at the top. The game you think you're playing, earn a salary, pay taxes, save what's left, that's not the game wealthy people are playing. They're playing a different game with different rules. And the gap between those two games is why wealth inequality keeps expanding. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. Boring index funds held for decades, borrowing against them instead of selling. That's the play. Not flipping NFTs, not timing the market. Just understanding the rules and using them. The people who win aren't smarter than you. They just have better accountants and enough assets to make the math work. Everything else is noise.